Okay, so Idaho Department of Correction now has 9 people under the sentence of death, 8 men, including the recent addition of Chad Daybell. There's also 1 woman. Robin Lee Rowe is currently housed in the Women's Correctional Center in Pocatello. But all this talk of the death penalty with the verdict and sentencing of that 55-year-old convicted of killing his first wife and 2 kids, that prompted several of you to message us to remind us about that lone woman, coincidentally convicted of similar crimes. Christy, for example, asked this: how long has Robin Rowe been on death row? I think it's been over 30 years. Do you know what her death warrant, when I should say, is probably what she meant, when it will be served? Okay, so Christy, yes, it has been more than 30 years. But before we answer the second part of that question, it might be a good time to remind others of why Robin Rowe has spent more than 30 years on Idaho's death row. In the early morning of February 10th, 1992, Robin Rowe set her home on fire. Inside was her husband, Randy, and her 2 children, 10-year-old Joshua and 8-year-old Tabitha. At first, the fire was considered a tragic accident, but 3 days later, the Ada County Sheriff's Office called it suspicious. 20 years after Rowe committed that crime, we spoke to the lead investigator, who referred to her then as a psychopath, a mass murderer, maybe even a serial murderer. KTVB's Jamie Gray also spoke to Randy's family back in 2012, who at the time were waiting to see if Robin's death sentence would soon be carried out.
I can remember everything that happened and everything we went through. And I feel like the end has not come, or the justice has not happened.
For 20 years, Chris Danielson has thought about February 10th, 1992.
My mother had called and told me that my brother was dead. And I am like in shock, like, you gotta be kidding, you know, you think this isn't true.
Her brother, Randy Rowe, was murdered by his wife, Robin Rowe.
Why she didn't see what she had and how lucky she was, I don't get it.
It was the same fire that killed Robin Rowe's 2 children.
There's Randy, Tabitha, and Joshua right there.
Current Ada County Sheriff Gary Rainey was the lead investigator on this case. He made the arrest.
This was probably the most premeditated, in some ways, premeditated for gain murders that I've seen.
Robin Rowe had taken out life insurance policies, $250,000 just on her kids.
For her, it was a matter of, would I rather have this money or would I rather have my husband and my 2 kids? And she's a sociopath, and so she could make the decision, I'd rather have the money.
If you love your family and your children, you don't kill them. She makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's how I feel about her.
After 20 years of waiting, Danielson hopes Robin Rowe is executed for her crimes.
I could understand them saying, well, you know, we got to give her a chance or whatnot. Well, she didn't give them a chance. They didn't get 20 extra years on their lives.
For me, understanding her personality and what she did, I think she deserves the death penalty. But every day up until that day, she's not able to manipulate other people. She's not able to get anything out of her web of lies. She's not going to kill any more children. And so she sits there 23 hours a day on death row and waits for that day to come. Then there's probably some justice alongside that.
Well, former Ada County Sheriff Gary Rainey also told us he believes Rowe was responsible for the deaths of her other 2 children. A daughter who died in 1977 in New Hampshire and a son who died in a Northern California cabin fire in 1980. But Rowe was never caught or charged for either of those. Rowe was convicted of 3 first-degree murder charges in 1993 and sentenced to death by a judge, which is different than how it's done today, where death sentences are decided by a jury. And that's because in 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Idaho's judge decides death penalty policy. Well, that violated the 6th Amendment of the Constitution. However, prior sentences were kind of grandfathered in, if you will. But there was an attempt to stay Rowe's execution in 1998 based on a mental evaluation. And this is where another appeal came into play and why Robin Rowe remains on death row 30 years later. In August of 2010, attorneys for Rowe tried to get her triple murder conviction thrown out, saying she had a traumatic brain injury prior to the 1992 fire, a congenital brain atrophy made worse by her disruptive childhood, which hindered her decision-making abilities. Her lawyers claimed her previous lawyers, they failed to argue that fact in court, and that appeal was thrown out by a federal judge in 2011. But that decision was appealed to a higher court. In October of 2021, the federal district court leaned toward granting a new sentencing hearing because of, quote, the shockingly inept and ineffective work of her state-appointed attorneys. But then came a U.S. Supreme Court decision in May of 2022, which said unless that ineffective counsel claim is first made at the state level, well, it can't be considered for a federal appeal. So in April of 2023, Roe's appeal was once again denied. But once again, that denial was appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where it is now. And last week, her attorneys with Capital Habeas Unit of Federal Defender Services of Idaho, they filed a brief on her behalf. So that is the latest, Christy, and why Robin Roe sits on death row after 30 years. So when will Robin Roe's death warrant be signed? Well, we don't know. It may never happen. We just don't know how this is going to play out. But now you know why the average time a convicted person spends on death row is more than 20 years.